Hello and good evening. Thank you, brave souls, for agreeing to stay for what could potentially be another 45 minutes. Let's go ahead and let things settle down here. Just to give you a little bit of an understanding of what I intend to be talking about this evening, I've geared my presentation towards beginners to the MYP. So if you were a British school family and you haven't had that opportunity yet, or if you're maybe new to the MYP in grade 8, some of this could potentially end up being refresher material for you if you've been to presentations previously, either by Mr. Ross Brown, our coordinator, or any of the middle school faculty. But I'm just going to be kind of going over some of the basics, and then we're going to get a little deeper, and by the end we're going to get real deep into it, and I hope that I haven't lost you by the time we're done. We're going to be looking at some of the sort of assessment details for the MYP. The one thing that I'm going to say, two things to get us going. First off, I'm trying to condense a 5-year program into about 40 minutes, and that's pretty complex. The MYP is a very broad curricula. There's a lot to cover, many details, and so I'm trying to fit into that framework. And the other piece is that this will not be the only opportunity you get to hear this. So the hope would be that we would repeat these sessions again next year, as well as any time that you feel like you need some one-on-one questions answered. We're always happy to work with you. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to start by focusing on what the MYP identifies as their core principles. The first one is the idea of holistic learning. The MYP does aim to educate the whole child. It's not just about pouring knowledge into the student. We're looking to build character. We're looking to grow the students in a wide range of skills beyond just can they memorize math facts, algorithms, equations. So that holistic learning component. A really important characteristic of the MYP is the idea that there is intercultural awareness. We're very blessed to be working in an international school. We can draw on our international community as well as be working with our host culture here in Korea. And so we really do aim to hit that intercultural awareness. And the last one seems a little strange, but I hope that it becomes more clear as we go through and look at the details of the MYP. This is a core principle that right away the MYP states is how important the idea of communication is. We can have very deep learning, but if we aren't capable of communicating that learning well, then we really have failed. So throughout the MYP, there is a common thread of the importance of communication. We'll be looking at that today. I'm going to dive into each one of these just a little bit sense of what we're talking about areas. So when I talk about holistic education, something that is a common thread across all of Seoul Foreign School is the idea of the approaches to learning skills. We categorize these into 5 big broad categories, having to do with communication and critical thinking skills, media literacy skills, research skills. But when really the best these are the skills we want students to leave our school with that go beyond just content area skills. So if you do a good job with the approaches to learning skills, then students will be able to be successful in whatever program of study they choose once they leave, or moving into the DP as well. We talk about the MYP being a conceptual-based program. The MYP itself identifies a series of key and related concepts. The key concepts actually stretch over all of the subject areas. And it's possible that any of those key concepts could be pulled into any of the subjects your children will be studying next year. The related concepts drill in a little bit deeper, but even some of those related concepts cross over between the different subjects. And we'll look at those again in a little bit more detail. But the idea of this holistic education relating to key and related concepts is that students are learning at the conceptual level and they're making connections between their subjects. We don't want learning to be in silos. So when they're learning about the concept of change in science, for instance, they could be talking about change. That same key concept could crop up in physical education. And then they would be drawing those parallels, the connections between the concept of change. It helps tie together the broader learning that students are doing. And then, of course, at the core of what we do being our IB learner profile, these are things that we want our kids to be when they leave school. We want them to be risk takers. We want them to be principled. We want them to be caring and engaged in our community. So really that idea of holistic education, we're teaching more than just content. We're trying to build up future citizens. That intercultural awareness piece comes through something really important to the MYP, which is this idea of global context. Again, global context isn't unique just to MYP. It's an IB concept stretching across the PYP program, the MYP program, and in the DP. But what we're trying to do with global context is give an authentic real-world connection to what they're learning about. So, you know, if they are studying a particular subject area in science, then they might be looking at innovation in technology and how that might be affecting crop growth in a particular country, and exploring some of the broader topics that are connected to that. Again, all of those tie back to 6 key global contexts that we use. Services action, we want students to be good members of the community. And so we talk about service. We try to tie service into the actual curriculum so that they see a connection between what they're learning and how they can take action on their learning. That idea of action is throughout all of the IB programs. You know, with PYP and the exhibition project that takes place in grade 5, and then in the MYP building up to the personal project in grade 10, and then in the DP program with what they're doing with their CAS, the service community as an action. So services action is the MYP component of that, and so we are giving kids both curricular opportunities to participate in service as well as outside of extracurricular activities to participate in service. And then this last one for intercultural awareness is really tied back to the idea of the global context, that the subject area content that they're teaching is taught through the lens of that global context. So they're connecting those two together. They're seeing the content and how it relates to the broader global context that they're looking at. So the idea of communication, I come back to the approaches to learning skills. There's a whole area of the approaches to learning skills that talk about communication and the importance of communication and how we build those skills up in students. This is a core principle and something that we talk about with teachers when we're planning, is that all teachers of the MYP, your science teacher, your math teacher, your PE teacher, they're all language teachers. And in some cases, that takes the form of teaching our discipline-specific language, you know, math language that's important there, and how do you communicate well in math. But you know, also in the traditional sense, in your language and literature classes, where we're teaching both you know, verbal communication skills as well as written communication skills. But it is core to everything we do in all subject areas, this idea of communication. When we look at the criteria that are a subject area in a little bit, that connection come through really strongly. And there it is, the subject criteria. So it is embedded in all of the subject criteria that we're going to look at least at some level, the importance of communication and building strong communicators. All right, so now we're gonna dive a little bit deeper. That's the real quick hit on the big picture of MYP. And I'm going to dive deeper into how assessment works in the MYP. This is the part that you're going to hear and you may not remember next year when your student enters high school, and that's okay. We'll revisit this, we'll revisit it again. There'll be plenty of opportunity for you to learn more about this, experience this, and get questions answered. These are symbols, I hope, that are pretty familiar to us. I know that this was my experience when I went to school. I would imagine that this is your experience on some level, either working in a percentage-based system or an A, B, C, D, or A minus or C plus. My real question is, what does an 84% mean? What does a 93% mean? Does that mean that I learned 93% of the content? Does that mean that I was there 93% of the days? Do I know A minus of the content? What does that mean? The MYP is not unique in trying to tackle assessment in a different way. But it is very good at trying to bring meaning to assessment beyond just an end final number. Yes, when we finish today, you're going to see that it does come up with an end final number. But the goal is that that number means something, and more importantly, not only could a student be able to tell you what that number means, they can tell you what the number before that meant, so where they came from, and what the next number means, where they need to go. That's the real goal with MYP assessment, is that students are able to see that path of learning and able to put the whole puzzle together from start to finish. So, in the MYP, what do we assess? What are we paying attention to? And again, this comes back to that idea of holistic learning, where we're looking at more than just content knowledge. That first red word up there, what do we know? Yes, we assess what we know in the MYP. That's important. Content knowledge is important, and we do that. I know that my experience going through school, and perhaps you can connect to this as well, your experience going through school, that was sort of the end of it. What do you know? What you learn, regurgitate onto the test. And I think MYP aims to go deeper than that. So we also want to know what students understand. How can they apply their knowledge? So yes, you've learned something, but what can you do with it? In addition, the MYP takes the next step of your skills. Okay, what skills have you acquired? Both the broad approaches to learning skills, as well as the content or discipline-specific skills. And then we aim to try to assess attitudes, feelings, knowledge. Really, one of the core principles being that we want to build reflective learners, students that are able to self-evaluate and identify areas of strength and weakness and how to improve. Key component. So we assess all of those different areas throughout the learning process. The MYP here says, the MYP approach to assessment recognizes the importance of assessing the process of learning as well as the products of learning. So it's not just at the end of the day, what can they make, what can they do. We want to know how they got there and if there are ways that we can improve. So assessment in the MYP, we got a little chart here where we're going to go through things that we try to emphasize and things that are potentially decreased emphasis. So first area of emphasis, we aim to use a range of balanced assessment strategies to allow students to show what they know, as opposed to really relying on that end of unit test. This takes the form of, we might have students doing a variety of projects where they're able to demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways as opposed to sitting an exam at the end of the process. Seeking student responses in order to evaluate their current understanding, that idea of checking along the way, as opposed to seeking the student responses, just to identify the right answer. Do they have it? Do they not have it? There's more to learning than that. Wanting to give students that regular and ongoing feedback throughout the units of work so that we're catching things early, that idea of formative assessment, that we're checking in throughout the process, again, as opposed to concluding with simply a unit test at the end. Teach, 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 give the test, and then from the test we find out what they don't know. That's a problem. But here's the key one. Enabling students to see assessment as a way to describe their own learning and the sole purpose of assigning a grade at the end of the process. I said that we really are wanting students to be able to identify, yeah, get a number, and they're going to come home and tell you, I got a 7 or I got a 4. But we want them to be able to tell you what the 4 means, tell you what the 3 meant, where they came from, and tell you what the 5 means and how they're going to get there. Okay, I said at the beginning that I was gearing this a little bit towards the British school community. So hopefully looks familiar to you. I've pulled this from the Guide for Understanding the British School Reporting System, which is a great system, again, aimed at a lot of the same principles the MYP is trying to achieve, which is getting you to understand where you are and where you could potentially go. So if you're looking at this, we've got the beginning, emerging, developing, which would be considered below age expected level at the end of the year. And then we have the secure, which is kind of where we expect students to be, and then extended and advanced, which would be stretching beyond. Those numbers across the top, while there are 6 colored boxes below and 7 numbers above, those 7 numbers represent the final 1 through 7 MYP grading scale, which we're going to dive into in just a little bit. But that sort of gives you a sense of the comparison. Again, this is directly from the British School Interpretation Guide for looking at your report. In addition, this is another diagram from that. This is a view you probably wouldn't see. This is a view of multiple students, but it does give you an idea of what it would be. So your student might be student number 2, where they're just all green in that area, or student number 3, where they're exceeding in some areas and then achieving at level in others. Maybe they're student number 1, and they're identifying areas for growth that they want to improve on. I've tried to isolate the front part of that, which is standards based out of the English National Curriculum. And then I'm going to sort of draw a comparison here to our criteria area in the MYP. So these would be, as I read them, they would sort of fall under Group 1 or language and literature criteria. So this is out of language and literature, and some of that language is similar. Okay, identify means using examples. So this is just one of the criteria. So drawing that connection that there is a lot of similarity between the English National Curriculum and how it divides up standards and what we're looking for, and these broader concepts that MYP uses for their criteria. All right, this is of text, and I apologize for that. I'm going to help break this down a little bit for you. Down the 8 subject areas that your children will be participating in next year. And then across the top, the MYP each area into 4 different criteria. We talk about this criteria A, B, C, and D. The grid then across says, so language and literature, the one we were just looking at, criterion A is analyzing. Do take a moment and look down the columns. Look down criterion A across all subject areas. Look down criterion B. These criteria areas match that first slide with the red text that we were talking about. Not perfectly, but in general, criterion A in most subject areas is the what you know. That's what we learned when we went to school. The focus on knowledge. What can we put back onto the test? Criterion B has much more to do with applying that. Okay? It's not universally true. Sometimes it's out of order. But in general, the goal is to have a criteria that matches that idea. Criterion C, we focus a lot on those skills, and you see communicating coming up multiple times. Communicating, the idea of being able to communicate. And then criterion D, having that reflective nature to what your learning is. Kind of thinking about your attitudes and that process and how you respond to things. So how do we assess those criteria areas? Because all work done in any of the subjects always then connects back to one of those criteria areas. So if you're working in language and literature and you're working on writing an analysis piece of Shakespeare, that would tie back into criterion A. And so then how does that work? Well, each one of the criteria broken into a number of objectives. Strands that give more detail. They're aimed at providing the direction. Because if you see, you can go back, really broad and general terms. So the objectives are aimed at giving direction for the criteria. We'll look at an example in just a moment. They're also leveled out by achievement. And that's that piece I've been talking about where we want students to be able to identify where they came from, where they are currently, and then where they need to go. So we level out by achievement. The student is able to look at it and say, I'm currently achieving a level 4. What can I do? We talk about command terms. Again, I know I'm throwing so much terminology at you. You will have an opportunity to hear this stuff again. But the command terms are what make the leveled by achievement. Those command terms are what tell us the difference between a 4 and a 5, or a 5 and a 6. And that's really important for students to be identifying those terms. It's good for you to be aware they exist, and in your discussions with students, with your children, then you can be identifying those key command terms. And then we do our best always to make because the language of the MYP is intended intentionally to be rather generic so that it can apply to a variety of different assessment types and different content that you're covering. So the teachers are constantly taking that generic language and making it task specific so that we know we're working on our Shakespeare essays. How does the analyzing criteria directly connect to our Shakespeare analysis essay? All right, I'm a design teacher. That's what I teach, so that weird Group 8 design class. So that's the sample I'm going to use to go ahead and look at how the command terms work, how the leveled by achievement works. So this is out of criterion A from design class. This is analysis and inquiry. So they're really learning about what their design project is going to be. And that is all rooted in finding a problem that they want to fix. So a level 1-2 score, they're just able to tell you what that problem is. The bold word is our command term. State the need for a solution to a problem. That's it, just the state. At the level 3-4, we'd be expecting them to be able to outline. So you can see how there's more critical thinking involved, there's more skill involved to be able to move from simply saying what the problem is to outlining maybe some of the specifics surrounding that problem and why their solution is going to address the problem. The 5-6 then levels up again. We use the word explain. So every one of those bold words has a definition. When I talk about explain in my design class, Explain means in their language and literature class, in their PE class, so the kids start to see those connections. When I'm teaching explain design, they can take that learning and apply it to their understanding of what explain means in science class. So at a 5-6 level, they're needing to explain. And then at the 7-8 level, we're asking students to be able to explain and justify it being a dot mark. So you can see how this builds as kids pair the definition of the command terms with the marks they get. The teacher assesses them and says, I currently feel you are only outlining, and you need to do these things to improve to move up to the explain level. Students are able to take that, look at the definition of explain, put it together with examples of explaining, and see how to improve their own path forward. So the last thing we're going to do is go through kind of a sample explanation of how we go into the final levels of assessing work in the MYP. All of the 4 criteria areas are assessed on a 1 through 8 scale. And this is one thing, if I could go and change about the MYP, I would encourage them to make this maybe a little more clear. Because we talk with students about what their 1 through 8 score is, and me as a teacher, that's the one I care about. I want them to be able to go back and look at my rubrics and learn how to improve. I want them to see that path forward. But at the end of the day, we do come up with, and we have to decide how these 4 criteria areas are going to turn into a final grade so that we can report a final grade at the end. So those 1 through 8 scores get converted into a 1 through 7 score, and it is a little confusing. But we're going to go through that example right now. So I'm looking at a science example now. We have criterion A, B, C, and D across the top. The numbers in the various boxes would represent different assessment tasks that have happened. So you can see the first one, they did an essay on air pollution. That was assessing criterion A, knowledge and understanding, as well as criterion D, reflecting on the impacts of science. Okay? And then moving down, you can see how all of those numbers work out. Now, it's important to know that there's no math taking place. We don't look at it and go 4, 6, 7, and then merge them together and get a score. Did I lose it? I'm back. There we go. There isn't averaging or some sort of taking place. And the best example I can give you on this is the idea of, let's say you're taking a taekwondo class. And you start out at a white belt. And you're learning and progressing through the process. And you study for 2 years, and you make it up to a black belt. And at the end, you take your test for the black belt, and now you are a black belt. We don't average all of your belts out and say, okay, you're an orange belt. We say you are the black belt. It's the same here. The teachers use their professional judgment to say, well, at the beginning, on the first step, the student was achieving at a level 4. But as they used their rubric and they progressed through the process, I felt like they were achieving better, and so I'm not necessarily going to hold that 4 against them, and then the score could potentially be higher at the end. Oftentimes, this comes down to the professional judgment of the teacher. You know, as we look at this example, it's possible that air pollution unit test was maybe not as important as the practical report on the effective measures of reducing air pollution. And so this teacher decides for this student, a 6 best reflects their score. Okay? So the teachers go through and they look at all of the numbers, and those numbers trickle down, and they assign a criterion score for all. And those numbers add up. Now, this is where math does come into it. They're not averaged, but they are compared against a grade band. Okay? And here's our grade banding system. So the grade boundaries are listed down the side. That score of 23 would put the student right at the top end of a grade band awarded at a 5. I really use this example intentionally because I think it's a good example to see, and sometimes parents get upset about this. You see 6, 6, 5, 6, they're 1 point short. It's so frustrating, and how does that calculate through to a 6 or to a 5? And we get angry about that. And I can understand that. But I want to recall back to what Jeff Holcomb said earlier this evening about how the IB program really works on stretching students as well as making it accessible for everyone. And this is really a good example of that needing to stretch, and it really does stretch beyond to get to that level 6 or 7, really take some stretching. But then we're going to I'll reveal here at the end. Each, as I said, each one of those numbers means something. Achieved at a. Go ahead and take a moment to read that descriptor. We look at the number. We A, B, C. And we're upset about that. My child's not a C student. But I think it's pretty clear if you read this descriptor, that is not describing what in our minds we think of as a C student. A student who generally produces high-quality work, communicates secure understanding. That word secure, connecting right back to the British School Report. Secure being the descriptor for on grade level. Okay? Demonstrates critical and creative thinking, uses knowledge and skills in familiar classroom and real-world settings, and with support in some completely unfamiliar settings. This is what we talk about, how it stretches students. Okay, so this would be kind of what we would expect as an on-level descriptor, right? The potential is there for kids to really reach and go beyond, but it is also accessible, like Jeff was saying earlier this evening. That's kind of my last thing to end on here for the evening. I really appreciate you sticking it out with me here to the end. I will be hanging out to answer some questions if you have any specific to the MYP. And again, as always, it was a huge amount of information. And so you will get this again in the future. There'll be an opportunity for you to engage again. Thank you so much.